Sure. So there's kind of two levels to this. So the smaller, not smaller, but I'm going to stick with it. Level of this is kind of like on an episode to episode basis. So what's been cool is because we do have kind of a fairly broad scope across the different societies and journals that we have. We've got obviously the three societies and 13 journals,
Mhm.
and books. uh we've done ones on like soil horizons in golf courses or mangrove forests, or like how mercury gets into perch because of woodland fires. Plant blindness was a really fun one, so that was like not that plants can't see, but that we don't actually see plants because we're just like, oh, it's just the background, which I'm sure you're very familiar with farms is just
Yeah.
like it's a set piece for a movie or whatever.
Mhm.
um but talking about how like that's kind of how we end up with like how everybody draws a tree is like two sticks with a cloud on it. They're
Mhm.
like, that's because of plant blindness, because we just don't pay attention to like, oh, not every tree looks like a cloud with legs.
Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brandon Black, and in today's episode, we're going to have a conversation with another fellow podcaster. Today with me, I've got Abby, and before we hop into things, I'm going to let her give her own little introduction. So, Abby, take it away.
Hi, thanks for having me on your show. Super happy to be here. My name is Abby Morrison. I work for a company called Access. That's the Alliance of Crop, Soil, and Environmental Science Societies, which is why we have an acronym. And we manage three scientific societies: the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. So we help them with publications, meetings, membership, kind of everything that you need to keep societies going. And I work in their publications department where I help authors get through the peer review system. And I also run our podcast, Field Lab Earth, which we've had since 2018, where I get to interview researchers all the time. And it's super fun.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like our podcasts have been around for about the same amount of time, so that's pretty cool. Yeah, no, that sounds like a lot of fun, and I definitely was really interested in learning about your podcast. I've listened to a couple episodes now, and we'll go into more of it in just a second. But I reached out because I was really interested in the science portion of your podcast. Obviously, you explore environmental sciences, and environmental sciences actually tend to tie into agriculture quite a bit more than people tend to realize, and so that was a big reason as to why I wanted to bring you on here. So I think just going into things, if you don't mind, would you be able to break down for us kind of what the primary purpose of your podcast is?
Sure. So our podcast is all about past and present advances in agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. So a bit of background on the show. I basically pitched it because I don't come from an ag background. And when I started working here, I was like, oh, wow, like there's a lot of cool stuff that people do that other humans don't know exist as like a entire fields of study. And so I was like, hey, and I also do a lot of creative writing. So like writers are really close to my heart. And I was just like, I really like want to help these authors get their work out there. As an author of any kind, like promoting your work is just a bear. It's so hard to get out there. So one of the big purposes behind this podcast is there's a few. So first would be just like helping promote the awesome work that our authors do. And just be like, yay, you're doing really cool stuff. Keep going. Another would be to get the like whoever is listening, be that a researcher or a general public, whoever, to like be aware that this research exists. Both for on the general public side to help them like be aware of all the different things that are encompassed in these fields that they may not be aware of, or all the cool research like, hey, we're learning to farm on the moon. Like, did you know that? Because that's a cool thing.
Mhm.
Um, so just things they might not be aware of, but also for researchers to help connect them. So they might find something that's in a completely different scientific discipline than theirs that they're like, oh, that would actually be really helpful. Or maybe I can develop a partnership with this person who's working on something that is related to me. So those are kind of some of the basic goals. I had another one and it flew away from my mind. So if I remember later, I'll share it. And if I don't, then it's a secret for all time.
Awesome. Sounds great. I can't tell you how many times this happened to me. It happened to me during our recording session. So and for those of you who don't know, Abby and I actually did just record an episode of her podcast, and so you guys will be able to check that out, and we'll share all the links and all that kind of stuff later on. I'm not sure when your episode's going up or in relation to mine, but we'll get that all figured out. Um, but yeah, no, that sounds great. It sounds like you're definitely doing a lot of great work in the science community, getting different researchers connected with each other and finding information that could definitely help with with their findings. Anyone who's listened to this podcast long term knows that I'm a massive science nerd, and that was actually my origin into agriculture. So it's always nice hearing from other people from the science community and what their what their roles are and how they engage with that kind of stuff. So I think that's just awesome. So what are, I know that you kind of already broke it down in kind of the purpose of your podcast, but what are the main goals for, your podcast and also for yourself?
I think a big goal for me is just helping people recognize what all is encompassed in these sciences, and also to really celebrate the authors and the work that they do to help them feel supported, um, and also to develop a lot of those cross-disciplinary relationships, which is kind of like a low-key goal that we we don't like push it super hard because it's probably just going to happen organically if it happens at all. But I just think it's cool to like learn about related fields to yours, even if it's not necessarily like super useful. And maybe you will find out that it's useful because we have a lot of episodes that are just like, oh, like like cover crops popped up on this episode, and like now we're talking about it on a different episode that you wouldn't think are related at all. So I think those are some of the goals is sharing the science in a way that is um, fairly easy for someone who is not like super ingrained in these fields. That's like a personal goal for me, is just making it like at we shoot for like high school level. I don't know how well we succeed on some of them, but we try. So yeah, I think those are some of our goals, is just communicating the science, celebrating the authors, and trying to build those relationships across all different sectors.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds very, very similar to another podcast I know that's all about, making connections and, helping people who don't always understand each other have better conversations and stuff. So have you seen a lot of, in your years of doing this podcast, have you seen a lot of success with, being able to make those connections and help people realize more about not just about what science is going on, but how those fields can connect to each other and all those types of intricate, topics you guys talk about?
I mean, it's hard to quantify.
Mhm.
We have definitely had occasions, well, an occasion to be completely honest, where we had someone like email us and be like, "Hey, can you connect me to this guest because I'm doing similar research and I want to talk to them." So that was really cool. I think I've seen more like anecdotal relationships or like social media relationships. So like anecdotally, like I have some family and friends that will listen and they're like, oh wow, like I didn't know that at all. Certainly me, as someone who's not an ag person, I've learned like boatloads of information and have like started to see those things connect. um because it's really like, for me, when I started here, I was like, wow, like agriculture is a really complicated ecosystem, and it's really hard to just like enter it and be like, I understand this entire network after like a day. It takes a lot to really
Mhm.
get oriented. to all those different spaces. So that's been like a growth factor for me. And I think for some other people, maybe, as far as like on the social media side, I think we've had, like guest podcast chains maybe, or gotten connections there, on podcasts that are like related content but not the same content.
Mhm.
So obviously, your podcast and mine, Planthropology, they're super active on Twitter, and then like it just turns into a giant podcast delta from there. So those are some examples of places where we've seen some of those connections be forged, more on the anecdotal side.
Awesome. Yeah, and you make a really good point, and I think it's really, really interesting how some of these fields, and the same even goes for the podcasting aspect of things too. How how much connection there can be, even even with like the tiniest level of things in common. So like obviously you and I run fairly different podcasts, I would say. They're both, in a sense about educating people and about, providing information on things that people tend to not have as much knowledge about. And they both regard agriculture in a sense. Yours is more about environmental science and mine's more about industry based, issues, but also, science is involved in it as well. Yet, we're still able to connect, and we have common knowledge on certain aspects. And the same goes for the the other podcasts that you had told me about, and some of the other ag podcasts that I've interacted with. There's a unique factor of being able to relate to each other. Oh, sorry about that. There's a unique factor in being able to relate to each other despite the lack of things in common across a certain level of communication. But I think it's really interesting that you've been able to see some of those connections happen, and have some of those great conversations with some of those researchers. So you mentioned that you learned quite a bit about the topics that you're talking about on the podcast, since you've started and since you joined. Would you mind kind of explaining some of the things that you've learned, or some things that you found interesting about what you've learned over the years?
Sure. So there's kind of two levels to this. So the smaller, not smaller, but I'm going to stick with it. Smaller level of this is kind of like on an episode to episode basis. So what's been cool is because we do have kind of a fairly broad scope across the different societies and journals that we have. We've got obviously the three societies and 13 journals,
Mhm.
and books. We've done ones on like soil horizons in golf courses or mangrove forests, or like how mercury gets into perch because of woodland fires. Plant blindness was a really fun one. So that was like not that plants can't see, but that we don't actually see plants because we're just like, oh, it's just the background, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, farms is just like it's a set piece for a movie or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but talking about how like that's kind of how we end up with like how everybody draws a tree is like two sticks with a cloud on it. They're
Mhm.
like that's because of plant blindness because we just don't pay attention to like, oh, not every tree looks like a cloud with legs. So like that was a really fun one. We've done ones on soil health or like history. We did one on Norman Borlaug recently. That was like super fun. That was a dream episode. Using like DIY and open source coding equipment, to do like plant seed phenotyping, which is like phenotyping is like basically like using clues that you can physically see or detect with the senses, to identify things rather than like genetic material. So those are kind of some of the ones that we'll learn on like an episode by episode basis. But I think on like a larger level, something that or a higher level maybe, that I've learned is just how interconnected everything is. And that can be both within the ag ecosystem. So like, food supply chains, or how researchers do stuff at a university, which is then translated into like extension work, which is then communicated out to farmers or the general public and certified crop advisors who are, kind of serving as that bit of a bridge of taking the research to the farmers, like those things, but also just like the world as an ecosystem of how, you know, like the nutrients that are in a plant that get into the soil and vice versa, and then they get into water, which then goes and, you know, or other things that are maybe not so good that get into water and cause algal blooms and the Great Barrier Reef to sort of die. um you know, like all of those things are so connected and in ways that I never anticipated or expected. So I think that's been really fun, is just to see those larger connections that you wouldn't naturally piece together.
Mhm.
Um and that's been really rewarding for me. I mean, just like generally as a person, the podcast is very rewarding and fun to do, but also just like it's like kind of this very like zen, like everybody does matter. Like, not
Mhm.
that I think that people don't, but like it's cool to see, like it just like makes me happy to be like, yeah, like it is really important that you're doing each of these episode level pieces of research, because it is impacting, you know, the perch research on mercury is going to affect the soil research, soil health research, and that's going to affect the cover crop research and blah de blah, like so on and so forth. um but I just really like that. It puts me in my happy space.
Yeah. No, that sounds awesome. And I mean that mostly does answer another question I had about, you know, why you think what you're doing is important. I'm not sure if you had anything else you wanted to add on to that in terms of that question.
I mean, I think that's like a big part of it, but I think it's also important, and I'm sure that you're familiar with this from doing your show, is like I think it's just really important to share like why these things are important to the people that are doing them. And as someone who does science communication to whatever level of success that I manage to do it, you know, that's something that we talk a lot about on the show or podcasts or related podcasts, is, you know, how to get the message out there and how to be, you know, that translator and bridge like you do on your show. But I think it's also important, like, it's not just important to get the knowledge out for the sake of the knowledge, but I think for me, it's also been important because, you know, these people are really passionate about what they're doing. And it's easy to be like, oh, well, like sitting around breeding like generation after generation after generation of like apple seeds
Mhm.
or, you know, wheat or whatever, like might not seem important, or something that it like or worse seems, well, maybe not worse than being unimportant, but you know, thinking that it's like boring.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, like, yeah, maybe it would be considered boring to do wheat breeding, but like Norman Borlaug saved like millions, if not billions of lives by doing wheat
Mhm.
breeding because he was passionate about it. And so I think, you know, as someone who, like every other human that's ever lived, has had cases where like people don't get as jazzed about the things that I get jazzed about.
Mhm.
I think it's nice and lovely to be able to provide a space for people to explain, like, this is why I do what I do. This is why it's helping you. This is why it could help save a life someday. Um, maybe even your life. I don't know. I mean, not you, Brendan, but like
Right.
you as the universal you.
Right.
Um, you know, but I think that's really important, and especially because they're authors, and that's like my heart song, is for writers, really, you know, being able to help them feel supported and to feel celebrated for the hard work that they do day in and day out, in a lab, in a field, in the woods, you know, wherever, like crazy location that they're doing ag science, which
Mhm.
for anyone who doesn't know is everywhere. Like, you know, it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to share that. So I think that's another big reason of why it's important.
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. That's awesome. And I think that you definitely illustrate a really good point there in saying that, you know, there's this common issue of people see, you know, researchers and, you know, people who do like outside field work and, you know, and that kind of stuff as maybe not the most exciting job because, like you said, they're reading books about how to breed apples all day, or they're crossing over wheat, wheat all day, or that's not something that necessarily pertains to their interests. The farmers face the same issue. People tend to see farming as as like a retirement based career. That's not a real job, or people don't see agriculture as something that is a not just something that's vital, but also something that's important and interesting. It's something that they have a place in, that not only, like, it's not just for retired old dudes who want to sit around and look at cows all day. Like, there's a certain level of innovation in agriculture that is needed. There's the technology portion of it, there's the research portion of it, the law based stuff, the regulations, all that kind of stuff is there too. And people don't tend to realize that because they have this image in their head that a farmer is somebody who wears overalls and a straw hat, and they have a piece of wheat sticking out of their mouth, and they carry around their porch their pitchfork, and they milk one cow with a pail, and but by hand. And that's just not how agriculture looks anymore. And so that is something that I think that we can agree on, is that people's perception of our shared conversation piece of science and agriculture is something that is kind of misconstrued today in public understanding of things. So I think that we definitely share a goal there in trying to get rid of some of that misconception and show people that things really can be interesting, even if it doesn't immediately spark your interest. If you look a little bit deeper, you might find something that would surprise you.
Totally. Yeah. And I would never look at farming as like, that's what I'm going to do when I retire. It's like wake up super early and work in the middle of the night, and like all of the hard work that goes into that. Like, no
Right.
way.
Yeah, no,
Never.
I've had some people on the podcast that were like, "Oh yeah, I've thought about when I retire, starting farming." I'm like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" Like,
No, not even as a hobby farm. I couldn't
no.
even do that as like a gardener,
Oh
hardly.
no. It's insane levels of dedication. I mean, I have a strong passion for the industry, and I don't even think I would make it as a farmer. It's so much.
Yeah,
But
they're incredible. I
yeah.
admire them so much. Definitely one of those careers where it's like mad respect, but I will never do that. Never. I just
Yeah.
can't do it.
No, exactly. But no, that definitely does it does give a good segue towards, like you mentioned, when you first got into the position you're in, you didn't have quite as strong of an understanding of how intricate agriculture is, how deeply it's tied into science and technology, and all the things that go on in agriculture, especially in terms of the environmental science aspects of it. So what have you learned about agriscience that you found interesting, or that you thought was kind of unique, that you hadn't realized before?
Sure. So I mean, I think obviously just like breaking the stereotype of like, oh, farmers are just like out in fields and
Hmm.
that's what they, or in a barn.
Right.
Um, so I think that was a big first step, was just starting to recognize that these kinds of sciences, can take place in all of these wild places, or like like a lagoon full of oysters. Like that's where that science is happening.
Right.
Or the moon, like I said, or a desert. Like it can really happen like anywhere. So I think that was a big thing. Seeing how much like tech is involved, which I think I would have like assumed, but just like didn't really think about. Um,
Hmm.
but I think um that's probably a little less surprising than some of the other stuff. But I think, um, give me a second. It's
You're
still
good. Take
there.
your
Um, oh yeah, it's just really complicated. I think is like what has really blown me away. Which is probably tied in a little bit with like the stereotype of like, well, if you just like are out in a field watering plants and then like picking them when they're ready, like if that's what your understanding of farming is, like, yeah, you're not gonna think it's super complicated. But you know, like frequently I'll have guests. I mean, for one thing, I did one episode on climate change modeling, and I have not felt so stupid in the longest time. I had to go back and forth with this poor guy, Budon Kent, and I went back and forth with him so often to be like, okay, but like what data is going into what model and what is the historical data doing and how does that work? Like
Oh
it was
yeah.
like model inception where just I felt so dumb and the whole episode was just me like repeating back what he had said to make sure that I understood and then being like, okay, now you can give me like the next portion. So like obviously there's a lot of just like high level science but also just
Mm.
the how complicated it is in that I frequently have guests where I'm like, yeah, but like how did you know that that one thing you were researching was the cause? Like because like we just did one on popcorn and it was talking about potentially having like genes that would then make popcorn genetically compatible with field corn,
Mm.
like slipping between them.
Hmm.
And they were talking about like so we like planted some popcorn around regular corn to see if they would like breed at all, and I was like, well, how do you know it's not the wind, or how do you know it's not like the humidity, how do you know it's not this? So like there's
Mhm.
so many like weird checks that they have to do of like going back and forth between, okay, let's try it in a lab where we can really like isolate it and make sure that it
Mhm.
is just this one thing, but then taking that into a field and it's like, well, now yeah, it worked in a lab, but now you're dealing with like the soil nutrients in one field are completely different across the entire field. Like maybe there's more nitrogen in this one spot than
Mhm.
or you've got now you have like runoff events that you didn't have to deal with. So it's just so complicated and then just how much it crosses from one discipline to another. And like some of our journals are like they're nuts. Like we've got a Vadostone journal. It might be pronounced Vados, so I'm sorry. I'm not sure. But they're like all about soil physics, and
Mm.
I'm like I can't even read these papers to see if I can interview you because it's crazy.
Mm.
Mad props to those people as well. But yeah, I think how complicated it is something that really draws me in, as well as just obviously like the cool stuff that they're doing that you would never guess would be related.
Yeah, no, that's definitely really interesting stuff. And I mean, you made a really good point there, which is something that I've tried to touch on a little bit on the podcast, but I haven't had a really good opportunity yet. That it's agriculture is such an unpredictable what's what I'm looking for? Enterprise, really, because like from the business perspective, it's probably one of the least predictable business operations you can run, just because you're basing off of the environment, and the environment's constantly changing, and it's constantly like there's things you can't account for, like you mentioned, wind and soil composition, and there's erosion you got to account for, and there's like this and the other thing. There's leaching you have to be ready for, and so like that level of commitment to a to an industry, to a to a business that potentially could just go up in flames in a single day, and you wouldn't have anything to do against it, is it's almost incredible that people just do that at all. I mean, obviously it has to get done because we need food, but why anyone would want to do that, or even do research on that kind of stuff, just because of the level of uncertainty is in there, is just it's kind of astounding.
Yeah, it's astonishing that people do that. And like that is just what's crazy to me is like you could have like a tornado or
Hmm.
a really bad storm or a drought and it's just like I like it's hard for me to come up with like another job that is just I mean other nature related jobs so like fishing maybe
Hmm.
stuff like that. But like that is so dependent on your environment. Whereas like mine is like, do I have Wi-Fi? Like, cool, I can do my job. Like, there you
Right.
go. Do I have a microphone? Cool. Like,
Right.
it's
Yeah.
crazy. So thank you, farmers, and like say thank you to farmers if you meet them.
Yeah, no, it really is insane, the level of the level of uncertainty they go into every day, because that's kind of a big thing too. Is I've talked to some people who are they're very business conscious. They have a good understanding of business, and they have a hard time comprehending how farmers could go out one day and their field be perfectly fine, and the next day they have no crops left, just because natural disasters happen, or like you mentioned, there's drought, or a freeze happens overnight and kills their entire crop, or like there's so much to account for, that it's it's kind of incredible that anything gets done in agriculture. But at the same time, agriculture has been practiced for so long that we know so much more on how to prevent that stuff, and we're constantly updating ways to keep some of those things from happening. I mean, like you mentioned, we're developing crops that are more resistant to certain types of issues like that, or like there's so much environmental research being done on soil erosion and on just soil nutrition in general, because that's a big thing that is I think somewhat of a newer development in science is our understanding of how important soil is to agricultural health, and how vital soil is in general to just being able to farm and to do pretty much anything we do in reality. So I think that's kind of amazing. I don't know if if you come across that conclusion about how vital soil is to everything around us pretty much, but that's what I've been kind of learning.
Oh, huge. It's hugely important. Crazy important.
Mm-hmm. No, it's definitely. I mean, I've learned recently that soil, like even like the earliest civilizations, because I've preached before on this podcast that agriculture was basically the founding father of civilization. Like the first society was founded because of agriculture, pretty much. And since then, like the earliest civilizations, like since their earliest form of written communication, basically we've known that they've had a deep tie in with the soil. Like even they realized without soil you don't get food. Like you have to have a healthy ground, or else you're not gonna be able to grow anything to eat. And like it seems like over the years we've kind of like lost that, and then now we're getting it back in, but now we're realizing just how important it is, because it's not just you won't have anywhere to plant anything. It's that if the thing that you're planting it in does not have the proper nutrients available, or the proper temperature, or the proper moisture content, or like if just one little variable is off, it throws off your entire operation. And it's crazy just how sensitive it can be.
Yeah, totally. It is yeah, it is so crucial. It's wild.
Yeah. So no, I wasn't sure. Kind of one of the things I found interesting about what you're doing is you're having conversations with these researchers, you're learning about what it is that they're looking into. And I've talked to a couple different agricultural, especially environmental scientists and that kind of thing. People don't tend to realize just how deeply connected agriculture is to the environment. People tend to think that agriculture and the environment are kind of enemies. They really rely on each other like a lot. The environment benefits from agriculture in a lot of ways, and in other ways it's hurt by it. But agriculture heavily, heavily, heavily relies on the environment to be steady, for it to be able to do anything it does. I don't know. Have you kind of learned anything from these researchers about just like I know we already kind of talked about like the natural disaster thing and like the soil health and that kind of stuff, but is there anything in particular that really threw you for a loop when you learned about it, in terms of like the environment kind of screwing over agriculture, for lack of a better word?
Um well, I mean, I'm usually like wowed by by like everything that I learn. I think speaking more to like the environmental science, and I know soil science was something in particular you were hoping to focus on. I don't know that I would say like that there's I mean, look, again, admitting that like I don't have the historical background on these relationships or whatever. Um but if there is animosity between the two, there shouldn't be. I guess is what I would my like just Abby, not society, not scientific like opinion is that like they're super intertwined. And so like some of the things that we see in our show pardon me is like the fact that it's like y'all, we need to like do better with the land that we have. And like I think um again, this might be me spreading nonsense, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like in the past a lot of the strategy has been like we'll just like make more land farmland. Like
Mm-hmm.
if you need more food, just make more farmland. And as like but the earth only has so much land, so that's
Mm-hmm.
not like an infinite strategy. And so a lot of the science that we see coming through our societies is like how do we get more out of the land?
Mm-hmm.
And that starts to get into territory where many people have many different opinions. So I don't have a firm one myself. um, but I think, whether that is, you know, better managing the nutrients, that's something I think everybody can agree on is, if you don't need to put the nutrients there, then like don't. You don't have to do that. Or, better stewardship of the soil is like a
Hmm.
big thing. Because that is where a lot of the nutrients are obviously coming from and going back to. Um, and really, soil specifically does serve as so foundational, insert ground joke there, I guess. But it is so foundational because, erosion and nutrients and runoff, like all of those are, and like I mentioned earlier, like the runoff that causes algal blooms and,
Hmm.
all of those environmental aspects are all tied into the soil. And so that is a resource that we really need to protect. And we recently had Dr. Ratan Lal on the show, and like his whole jam is soil health. Like that is his bread and butter. And he just won the World Food Prize this year, which is basically like the Nobel Prize for agriculture because the Nobel Prize like can't have one for agriculture. Um, because it like wasn't in their original like what was stipulated for what they could have.
Wow.
It's not like they're just like I don't want one. They're like we want one, but we literally can't add new categories or something like that. But anyway, so now we have the World Food Prize, which is founded by Norman Borlaug, because he did want to have a Nobel Prize for ag. So they just made one themselves, which is great. So anyway,
Awesome.
uh, so Ratan won this year, and so we had him on the show. That was like so humbling and amazing. He's just like everything he says is just so profound and wise. You just want to like sit and listen to him for hours. And like he is like guys, like it's all connected. Like that is his jam is like this holistic approach. And he talked a lot about how, when you strip resources out of a soil, like it's way harder to like deal with the repercussions of that than it is to just try to like take care of it from the
Hmm.
start. And so, we've obviously seen like the Dust Bowl was a huge example of like erosion and the nutrients like being, stripped away. And obviously that had terrible repercussions. And so if we pay attention to, the environment and take care of it to start with, then there are people who are like, well, if you take care of the land better and like use things like precision agriculture where sorry, this is a bit of a ramble, but they're like, if you use precision agriculture, which is basically like, hey, if you have that one part of your field that floods every single year, like maybe just don't bother. Like, why are you putting seed there if you know it's gonna die anyway? Like, so
Hmm.
or using the topography of the land to like better do farming. Such a so articulate. Do farming better. Uh that but if you are using that or like using the history of like where have there been fertilizer inputs or nutrient inputs before so that you're not like stacking more nutrients where you're probably maybe fine in that spot, like all of those strategies are good ways that are tend to be in my unscientific understanding again not the pro um you know those tend to be kind of more beneficial for the environment. Like another really good example is like buffer strips. So they're like if you are near like a stream, maybe plant some plants there that are going to keep the nutrients from like running out of your field so you're not wasting money, and it also has the environmental benefit of like not putting fertilizer into the stream or those nutrients that algae or whatever organism you're trying to avoid might feed off of. So really trying to partner some of these scientific advances, like you said, be that precision agriculture or just like regenerative agriculture is a good like buzzword, I guess. Integrated pest management is something we're going to be talking about on our show a lot. in this little season here of like, instead of just spraying pesticides on a schedule, like be like, oh, well, like, do we need to though? Like, are there actually that many like pests right now? And if there's not, then we could maybe just like suffer a little bit of a yield loss, but not kill beneficial insects by spraying a pesticide. Anything like that. Are things that I have learned as far as the like environment and also farming uh knitting together, I guess.
Awesome. Well, it definitely sounds like you've learned quite a bit. I mean, those are all topics that we've discussed somewhat briefly here on the podcast before, but they're definitely really important to to have conversations about. Like you mentioned, a big one that I've run into a few times is people asking like, okay, well, what's so bad about like urban development? I always have to explain to them like, well, if you have to develop more city, you have to take away more farmland and more environmental land and all that kind of stuff. And like, okay, well, if we run out of farmland, we could just take down some parts of the city and build farmland again, right? It's like, doesn't really work that way, but it's I don't think you realize like it takes 200 to 400 years for topsoil to just like a centimeter of topsoil to reform. Like it doesn't really happen overnight. You don't just get that soil back. So if you destroy the ecosystem of that soil, you're done. You're not getting another farm there for a while. So it's vitally important that we have these conversations. And this is a big portion of the the reason behind the podcast is to have a better conversation with the consumer about why preserving land for both agricultural use and for environmental use is so important. Not that urbanization is necessarily the worst thing. We don't want people to not have housing if they need housing, but if we're destroying more land than we're utilizing, then we're starting to have an issue. And so I would talk to them about that, and I would talk to them about like what, like, basically what can we do about it, because you hear some arguments about like how we could just get rid of all of like the animal agriculture and just produce crop based agriculture for because it would produce more of a yield. Okay, well, yeah, for one, it's not going to feed as many people though, and for two, not all land can grow crops and not all land can grow the same crops. And so that's a big conversational barrier that tends to get left out, is that land isn't universal. Like land has certain level of nutrients available. Soil has different levels of fertility for different types of crops. That's why some soil, some parts of like I live in California, for example. We're very agriculturally productive. We have very fertile soils, but we can't grow the same crops in different parts of the state. I live in the Central Valley. We're not going to grow strawberries here, but we can grow them up, by the coastline where the soil fits their needed environment. And so, having those conversations with people, and this kind of goes back to your, scientific literacy kind of thing that you were talking about, having the conversations with people to help them understand why, this preservation of land for agricultural and for environmental use is so important, could be a big step towards kind of improving the relationship between consumer and producer, and also improving the relationship that would help innovate some of those new technologies that are kind of helping out with agricultural production, that helps them stay more holistic. And that's kind of something I've noticed too, is that holistic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, whatever you want to call it, is such, it's definitely got its beneficial factors, and the technology that's being incorporated today has its beneficial factors, but they're not being incorporated together as often as I think that they should be. Like, we almost need to combine like old methods of agriculture and future methods of agriculture in order to get the best of both worlds. Use like precision agriculture, like you were talking about, because we have tons of new precision technology coming out. I did an interview with Fielden, and they have all kinds of new precision agriculture ag tech that they've been unveiling and that kind of stuff, and combine it with holistic methods, with partnerships with like environmental scientists, and just kind of like put everyone's heads together on this thing, instead of just trying to see who could figure out the fastest, basically. And I think we might have kind of a better long-term result that way. I don't know if you agree or not.
I totally agree. I mean, I think that speaks to a lot of what we're hoping to do on the podcast, is building those relationships, because each part is crucial, and when it is so intertwined, like, each part really does impact the other. And so I mean, I also just love collaboration in general. Like, I really really like it. And So yeah, I think I totally agree that, working together and building those partnerships, which, again is like really complicated and it's
Mhm.
like not always easy because it is hard to have someone who is like a PhD in soil physics be able to translate those to like the everyday layperson, and again, not because of intelligence, but just
Mhm.
because of discipline and what you put your time into to learn, basically.
Right.
I mean, I would probably never be at that level because that's not my strong suit, but that's okay because I have other things that I'm good at. So that's someone else can take that for me.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that, there's definitely, like you mentioned, it's important that we establish these relationships in terms of, not just the relationships between the environmental scientists and the farmers and, the people involved in actually producing the food, but in having the conversations like you and I are having, with consumers, with people who are going to be making these decisions, because at the end of the day, it's going to be their choice whether or not a lot of this stuff gets done. Their purchasing decisions, their voting decisions, their general attitude towards these new technologies and new sciences are going to be what determines a lot of this kind of stuff. I mean, we've seen in other countries that modern agricultural technology and sciences are even completely outlawed just because the citizens aren't totally on board with it. Like if that kind of stuff happens here, just because people don't really know what's going on, then that's not the farmer's fault. It's not the scientist's fault. It's our fault for not telling them what's going on. We need to help them make sure that they're not only in the loop, but it's going to help them, it's going to benefit them, that they're going to enjoy it, and that it's something that we need their help with too. That getting them in on the loop might be kind of the ticket to kind of getting this thing going. And I think that's kind of the purpose behind both of our podcasts is to try to unite, again, not just the science and ag worlds, but every potential world we can into one conversation.
Mhm. Yeah, totally.
Awesome. I think those are, that's kind of a good foundation for what I was wanting to get across. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, or any other questions or comments you wanted to make.
No, I think that's pretty thorough. I mean, if people want to talk to me more about stuff, always happy to provide an opinion that may or may not be helpful.
Awesome. Well, yeah, no, I definitely think that your podcast provides a lot of great information on a lot of different aspects of science and research and that kind of stuff. So if people want to reach out to you or want to learn more about what it is you do, if they want to listen to your podcast or any of that kind of stuff, where can they find you?
Sure. So, the podcast is called Field Lab Earth. We do have a Twitter account, which is the same, uh, Field Lab Earth, and that is kind of our main location, social media wise. So you can DM us there. You can email us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org. That's plural on societies for that one. As far as the podcast itself, you can find it pretty much anywhere that you find your podcast. We have a specific website for us, but anywhere, Apple, Google, Spotify, anywhere you wanna give a listen, we'll probably be there. And if we're not, let us know, and we'll figure out a way to join you in your little sphere or big sphere, wherever you are.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'll definitely have all the links down in the description so you guys can go check out Abby's podcast. I know I definitely have enjoyed listening to the episodes I've listened to, which I mean, science nerd, so I guess that makes sense. But no, it's a good time, and if you guys enjoy this podcast, you'll definitely enjoy that one. It's got a lot of great information on there, especially if you're a fan of more of the higher level conversations that we have on here. It's definitely some good stuff. And like I mentioned, it's important that you guys learn about this kind of stuff too, and that you're involved in the conversation, because this is your future we're talking about. So, yeah, I think that's a good place to start and a good place to stop. And that's all I can think of. So, thanks again, Abby, for coming on the podcast. It was definitely a lot of fun having this conversation with you.
Great. So happy that you invited me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a lot of fun. So, thanks again. Thanks to all my listeners for tuning in and for all the supporters that help out with this podcast. You guys know where to find me on all my social medias, all over, anywhere you find podcasts, just look up Talk Ag to Me, and you'll be able to reach out to me if you guys have any ideas for episodes. If you have any questions for me or my guests, please, reach out and we'll be happy to respond to you. But that's it. So I hope you guys, join us for next week's episode. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.